Imagine waking up one morning and your savings, your entire life's financial security, has quietly lost 30% of its value. Not because of something you did, not because of bad investments, but because two countries, thousands of miles away from you, decided to go to war. That country is India. And that war? It hasn't happened yet. But I'm going to show you exactly what happens to India. Its economy, its currency, its people. The moment Iran and America pull the trigger. There is a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman. At its tightest point, it is just 33 kilometers wide. You could drive that distance in under 30 minutes. That waterway is called the Strait of Hormuz. And through those 33 kilometers flows roughly 21% of all the oil traded on this planet. Every single day. Saudi oil, Iraqi oil, Kuwaiti oil, UAE oil, all of it, funneled through this one impossibly narrow corridor before it fans out across the globe. Now here's the question nobody asks loudly enough. What happens to India if that corridor closes? Most people assume India is just a bystander in a US-Iran conflict. A country that watches from the sidelines, maybe issues a diplomatic statement and moves on. The reality is far more brutal. India is the world's third largest oil importer. Let me say that again so it lands properly. Third largest in the world. Every year, India imports over 230 million metric tons of crude oil. And where does the majority of it come from? The Middle East. Iraq is India's single largest supplier. Saudi Arabia is second. The UAE, Kuwait, and, critically, Iran itself have all been part. The Middle East accounts for nearly 60% of India's total crude oil imports. This isn't just a trade relationship. This is a lifeline. India's entire industrial economy, its factories, its trucks, its power plants, its agriculture, runs on oil that travels through or originates near the Strait of Hormuz. Every motorcycle on a Delhi street, every tractor in a Punjab field, every cargo truck on NH 44. All of it depends on that 33-kilometer strip of water staying open. But here is where things start to get dark. To understand the stakes today, you need to go back to 1979. Before the Iranian Revolution, Iran was America's closest ally in the Middle East. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was essentially Washington's man in Tehran. Iran supplied oil. America supplied weapons and political protection. It was a clean, convenient arrangement. Then, in 1979, everything collapsed. The Shah was overthrown. Ayatollah Khomeini took power. And the very first thing the new Islamic Republic did was declare America its permanent enemy, the Great Satan, in their own words. What followed was one of the longest-running geopolitical hostilities in modern history. Every decade since 1979 has produced a new flashpoint, a new crisis, a new near-miss that almost became a full-scale war. The 1979 hostage crisis, the 1988 tanker war, the 2003 Iraq invasion that reshaped the entire region, the 2015 nuclear deal that briefly offered hope, the 2018 sanctions that killed that hope, the 2020 assassination of Qasem Soleimani that brought both countries to the edge of open conflict, and the 2024 direct missile exchanges between Iran and Israel that reminded the world just how thin the line between proxy war and real war actually is. Through all of it, India has been watching nervously, because India cannot afford for any of these near misses to become a direct hit. Let's be precise about what a real US-Iran war actually looks like. I'm not talking about the low-level proxy conflicts that have been happening for years. I'm talking about a direct, open military confrontation. Phase 1 begins with an American strike. Whether it's Iran crossing a red line on nuclear weapons, a large-scale attack on a US base in the region, or an incident that spirals out of control, the trigger gets pulled. America responds with naval and air power, targets inside Iran, missile sites, nuclear facilities, military command centers, come under sustained attack. And Iran's response? Iran does what it has been preparing to do for 40 years. It mines the Strait of Hormuz. It deploys its fleet of fast attack boats, hundreds of them, to harass and threaten any tanker trying to transit the strait. It fires ballistic missiles at US bases in Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. It activates Hezbollah in Lebanon. It activates proxy militias in Iraq. It activates the Houthis in Yemen, who, as we've already seen in 2024, are very capable of disrupting Red Sea shipping. In a matter of days, not weeks, not months, the entire Persian Gulf becomes a war zone. And every oil tanker captain in the world makes the same decision simultaneously. They turn their ships around. When that happens, when even a handful of tankers refuse to transit Hormuz, oil markets don't wait for confirmation. They don't wait for a ceasefire negotiation. They don't wait for a UN resolution. They panic immediately. In 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and threatened Middle East supply, oil prices doubled in 4 months. In 2019, after drone strikes on Saudi Aramco facilities knocked out just 5% of global supply for a single day, oil prices jumped 15% overnight. Now imagine not 5%, not a single facility, but 21% of global oil supply halted indefinitely. Conservative estimates from energy analysts suggest oil could breach $150 per barrel within weeks of a Hormuz closure. Some models go beyond $200. For most Western countries, that is painful. For India, it is catastrophic. Here's why. India has not one, not two, but 3 simultaneous vulnerabilities that make it uniquely exposed to a US-Iran war. No other major economy in the world faces this specific combination. Vulnerability number 1. The oil bill. India currently spends roughly $150 billion every year importing crude oil. That is its single largest import item. It dwarfs everything else India buys from the world. If oil prices double from current levels, India's annual oil import bill doesn't just increase, it explodes. We're talking an additional $150 to $200 billion drain on India's foreign exchange reserves. To put that in perspective, India's total foreign exchange reserves are around $600 to $650 billion. In an extreme oil shock scenario, India could burn through 25 to 30% of its entire reserve buffer in a single year just paying for oil. Vulnerability number 2. The rupee. Here's where it gets personal for every Indian. When India's import bill explodes, India needs more US dollars to pay for that oil. To get more dollars, Indian buyers have to sell rupees and buy dollars in currency markets. That selling pressure on the rupee is immense. And in every historical oil shock, the Indian rupee has weakened sharply against the dollar. In 2013, when the US Federal Reserve merely hinted at tightening monetary policy and oil was elevated, the rupee collapsed from 54 to nearly 69 to the dollar in just a few months. In a full Hormuz closure scenario, currency analysts have modeled rupee levels that most Indians would find genuinely alarming. But here is where things take a dark turn. When the rupee weakens, India doesn't just pay more for oil. India pays more for everything. India imports sunflower oil. Largely from Ukraine and Russia, India imports pulses. India imports fertilizers. India imports coal. India imports electronics components. India imports defense equipment. Every single one of these items is priced in dollars. When the rupee falls 10%, the price of every imported good in India rises by roughly 10%, automatically, before any other supply chain disruption is even factored in. In an oil shock scenario, where the rupee might fall not 10% but 20% or even 25%, India faces a wave of imported inflation that hits the most vulnerable people hardest. The farmer who buys fertilizer, the family cooking with vegetable oil, the auto rickshaw driver filling a tank, the middle-class family running an AC through a Delhi summer. This is not an abstract economic graph. This is the lived reality that tens of millions of Indian families would face, not because of anything India did, but because 2 countries went to war. There is another dimension to this story that almost nobody talks about. India's connection to the Middle East isn't just about oil. It's about people. Nearly 9 million Indians, mostly from Kerala, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Andhra Pradesh, work in Gulf countries. They work in construction, healthcare, hospitality, logistics, oil fields. Every month, they send money home. India receives more remittances from the Gulf than from any other region on Earth. The Gulf accounts for roughly 55% of India's total remittance inflows. In 2023, India received over $125 billion in total remittances, making it the world's largest remittance recipient. Take away the Gulf contribution, and you've just torn a $65 to $70 billion annual hole in India's balance of payments every single year. But wait, it gets worse. In a war scenario, it's not just that remittances slow down. It's that those 9 million Indian workers need to come home. India has done emergency evacuations from the Gulf before. In 1990, during the Kuwait crisis, India evacuated 170,000 Indians in what was then the largest civilian evacuation in history. In 2015, during the Yemen conflict, India evacuated thousands more in Operation Rahat. A full US-Iran war would dwarf both of those crises. We could be talking about evacuating millions, at cost, under fire, against a backdrop of an already collapsing rupee and exploding fuel prices. The human cost and the financial cost of that evacuation would hit India simultaneously. from multiple directions, all at once. Now here is the piece of this story that makes India's position uniquely painful. India cannot simply pick a side. Let me explain why. On one side, the United States. America is India's largest trading partner. American technology companies are deeply embedded in India's economy. The US is India's most important strategic partner against China. India's entire foreign investment ecosystem runs on American capital and American institutional relationships. If India sides with Iran, or even appears neutral in a way that America reads as pro-Iran, it risks damaging the most strategically important bilateral relationship India has built since 1991. On the other side, Iran. India has historically maintained warm ties with Tehran. India was one of the few non-Muslim countries to maintain normal trade relations with Iran through decades of Western sanctions. Iranian oil was cheaper. The Chabahar Port, a $500 million Indian infrastructure investment in Iran, gives India a land route to Afghanistan and Central Asia that bypasses Pakistan entirely. If India fully backs the American position and cuts all ties with Iran, it loses Chabahar. It loses its Central Asian connectivity strategy. It loses the strategic leverage it spent decades building. And there's a third player in this geometry that makes it even more complicated: China. In 2021, China quietly signed a 25-year strategic partnership agreement with Iran, worth $400 billion. China gets discounted Iranian oil, Iran gets Chinese investment, technology, and diplomatic cover. If a US-Iran war erupts, China doesn't stop buying Iranian oil. China has the political will and the naval capacity to maintain some supply relationship with Iran regardless of what America does. China has also been deliberately diversifying its energy sources: Russia, Central Asia, domestic renewables, for years, so while India's economy is being strangled by the oil shock, China, India's primary strategic rival, is actually in a relatively stronger position. China might even be absorbing discounted sanctioned Iranian oil while India scrambles to find alternative supplies at crisis prices. The geopolitical irony is almost cruel. A war that India had nothing to do with, a war India didn't want, a war India tried to prevent through diplomacy. And China comes out ahead. Let's bring this home in the most direct way possible. What happens to your money? In every historical oil shock, Indian equity markets have sold off sharply. In 1990, after Iraq invaded Kuwait, the Sensex dropped. In 2008, when oil hit $147 per barrel, Indian markets collapsed alongside global markets. In 2020, the combination of oil volatility and geopolitical risk sent the Sensex into freefall. A US-Iran war scenario is not comparable to any of those historical events. The scale of the supply disruption would be larger, the duration would be more uncertain. And this time, India enters the crisis with a current account that is already under pressure. Foreign institutional investors, the FIIs who hold hundreds of billions of dollars in Indian stocks and bonds, don't wait for a war to officially begin. They see geopolitical risk rising and they pull capital out of emerging markets first. The exit of FII capital weakens the rupee further. The weaker rupee raises inflation further. Rising inflation forces the RBI to hike interest rates. Higher interest rates slow economic growth. And suddenly, India's 6 to 7% GDP growth story, the narrative that has attracted global capital for the last decade, starts to look very fragile. This is not speculation. This is precisely the chain reaction that has played out, in smaller form, every time there has been a Middle East shock in the last 50 years. Here is the honest answer to whether there is any way out. India has been working on reducing its vulnerability for years, and some of that work is real and meaningful. India's renewable energy push, which is now the third largest solar deployment in the world, is a genuine long-term buffer against oil dependency. Every megawatt of solar power India builds reduces the number of barrels it needs to import. India has also been working on its strategic petroleum reserve, underground storage facilities that can hold enough crude oil to give India about 9 to 12 days of supply cover at current consumption rates. 9 to 12 days sounds reasonable in a normal supply disruption. In a sustained Hormuz closure, which could last weeks or months, it is not remotely sufficient. India has also been diversifying its oil sources, buying more from the United States, Russia, and West Africa. This diversification accelerated dramatically in 2022, when Russia became available at massive discounts following the Ukraine war. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even with all of that diversification, even with all the progress India has made, the Middle East still accounts for the majority of India's oil imports. the Strait of Hormuz is still the single most important choke point for India's energy security. You cannot fully diversify away from geography, and the geography of the Middle East is India's permanent vulnerability. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo lasted just 5 months. Oil prices quadrupled. The United States, the world's richest country, experienced petrol rationing, economic recession, and a fundamental reconsideration of its entire energy policy. That 5-month disruption reshaped global geopolitics for the next 50 years. It pushed America toward domestic oil production. It accelerated nuclear power development in France and Japan. It planted the seeds for the eventual U.S. shale revolution that would take another 4 decades to bloom. Every one of these strategic pivots happened because of a 5-month supply shock. India has not yet experienced a shock of that magnitude. India has had close calls. India has had uncomfortable price spikes. But the real shock, the one that forces a permanent strategic rethinking, has not arrived yet. U.S.-Iran war could be that shock. And the nations that prepare for structural shocks before they arrive are the ones that emerge stronger on the other side. The nations that are caught unprepared spend a generation recovering. India's path forward rests on 3 pillars. The first is accelerating energy independence. India's renewable transition needs to move faster than it is currently moving. Not just solar and wind, but green hydrogen, which India is already positioning to become a global leader in. The faster India reduces the oil intensity of its economy, the less exposed it is to Middle East shocks. The second is building deeper strategic petroleum reserves. 9 to 12 days of coverage is inadequate. The IEA standard for developed economies is 90 days. India needs to close that gap. The investments are expensive, but they are a direct insurance policy against the exact scenario we've been describing. The third is maintaining diplomatic optionality. This is India's greatest strategic asset, and it needs to be protected. India's ability to talk to Washington and Tehran simultaneously, while also maintaining ties with Moscow and being part of the Quad, is not fence-sitting. It is the most sophisticated form of strategic autonomy available to a country of India's size and complexity. Abandoning that optionality to score points with any single partner would be the most expensive diplomatic mistake India could make. Because, in a war, everyone needs a broker. And the broker always has leverage. Step back for a moment. What we've been describing is not just an India story. It's a story about how deeply interconnected the modern global economy is, and how a conflict in one corner of the world sends shockwaves through every corner simultaneously. Age of isolated conflicts ended the moment global supply chains became the backbone of civilization. When the world runs on oil that flows through a 33-kilometer corridor, that corridor is everyone's vulnerability. Whether they know it or not, India knows it. India's policymakers, its central bankers, its strategic thinkers, they are acutely aware of this exposure. The question is not whether India understands the risk. The question is whether the investments being made today are fast enough and large enough to reduce that risk before the next crisis arrives. History does not send polite warnings before it arrives. Here is the thought I want to leave you with. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide. That's it. 33 kilometers. Barely wider than the distance between Connaught Place in Delhi and the Noida border. And the economic fate of 1.4 billion Indians. Their fuel prices, their food prices, their savings, their jobs, runs through those 33 kilometers every single day. Empires have risen and fallen over choke points like this. The British built their entire empire around controlling sea lanes. America's post-World War II dominance was built on controlling exactly these kinds of strategic corridors. India's challenge in the 21st century is to build an economy strong enough and diversified enough that no single corridor, no single crisis, no single war can hold it hostage. India is not there yet. But it is moving. The only question is it moving fast enough? That is a question that every Indian, every investor, every policymaker, every family planning its future should be asking right now. Not when the war starts. Right now. If you watched this entire video, you already understand something that most people in most news cycles completely miss. The real stories, the ones that actually affect your life and your money, are not always the ones making headlines. They're in the economic histories, the trade routes, the supply chains, the geopolitical decisions made in rooms where nobody was watching. That's what this channel is about. Not clickbait, not panic, not political cheerleading. Finance history told like a thriller. Because that's exactly what it is. If you want to understand the next crisis before it arrives, if you want to be the person in the room who actually knows why things are happening, then this is your community. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because the next story I'm working on is going to connect dots that nobody else is connecting right now. And you're going to want to be there when it drops.